Greetings, Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the history of Catholicism in U.S. history, and moving into the unfolding of the 20th century. The year 1911 began a very unsavory period, or is another episode. So the background, recall in the late 19th century, part of the Americanism crisis was an ethnic clash within the clergy of the United States, as well as the faithful, between Irish Catholics and German Catholics. As a result of which, the German Catholics won the right from Rome to have ethnic parishes, meaning German parishes, or German national parishes, whereas the Irish won a prohibition against ethnic dioceses. So after winning, having their own national parishes where they could teach German, the German Catholics in the United States in the next generation, now we're in the 20th century, proved reluctant and resistant to extend to Polish immigrants the same consideration they had demanded for themselves. As the Polish immigrants wanted ethnic parishes and schools, to preserve their language and their culture. So the German leader in this was Sebastian Mesmer, Messmer. He was Swiss. He was born in Switzerland, immigrant to the United States. He served as Bishop of Green Bay, Wisconsin, from 1891 to 1904, and then as Archbishop in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, following the death of Francis Katzer. So Mesmer was Archbishop in Milwaukee from 1904 until his death in 1930. The other side, the Polish resistance against what they regarded as the unfair domination by ethnic Germans of the Catholic Church in the central United States, was led by an immigrant Polish family named Kruska, Kruszka. Michael Kruszka established the newspaper, the Polish Courier, in 1888, and with his brother Joseph, edited it for the next 33 years. Michael also eventually became the first ethnic Polish person to be a state senator in Wisconsin. Relatives of theirs, father, so those two, Michael and Joseph, remain laymen. So Father Wenceslaus Kruszka authored a 13-volume history of the Polish people. And another brother in the family, Father Simon Kruszka, had served time in prison for violating anti-Catholic laws imposed by the Lutheran government of Germany over their parts of occupied Poland. And then after his release, he came to the United States seeking religious freedom. The drift of some Polish Catholic immigrants into schism, into what was called the Polish Catholic Church, but the Jansenist, the old Catholic Jansenist Church, along with the memory of the loss of the Ruthenian Uniates after the conflict between Archbishop Ireland of Minneapolis, of St. Paul, Minnesota, against the Ruthenian priest Alexis Toth, which we covered earlier in the 19th century, prompted some concessions in this case. So in 1911, which is why I'm talking about it at this point, the first victory for the Polish immigrants was the appointment of a Polish-speaking man, prelate, as auxiliary bishop in Milwaukee. His name was Joseph Kudelka, Koudelka. Now, he was ethnically Czech, but he was Polish-speaking. Second, in 1913, a Polish-born, this time, priest, Father Edward Kozlowski, Kozlowski, was ordained auxiliary bishop of Green Bay, Wisconsin. In 1915, another Polish-born excuse me, prelate became Bishop of Green Bay, and he was the first ethnic Pole to be an ordinary of a diocese, and his name was Paul Rode, R-H-O-D-E. Mesmer's attempt to discredit the Krushkas as being divisive only enhanced their folk hero status among their fellow Poles. And in 1914, not everybody went. I mean, some of the Poles were so angry they left. They joined the Schismatic Catholic Church, the Polish American Church in Wisconsin, and were lost. Just lost for good. All right. In 1912, another step toward the First World War occurred. A war in the Balkans, another one. This one of Montenegro against the Ottoman Turks. And as the fighting proceeded, Bulgaria and Serbia joined in. The great powers involved, England, France, Germany, Austria, Russia. And in this case, they all colluded to keep the Ottoman Empire alive. They called it the sick man of Europe, but they colluded to keep it alive because they were afraid what would happen because it's such a huge territory, all the current Middle East. If they'd rather deal with one one minimally capable government rather than face what would happen when it fell. And we know what would happen because we're still living with it. But anyway, that happened. Same year, 1912, April 14th, you fans of Downton Abbey will know this is how it started. The Titanic sank. Or earlier, those of you fans of the movie, the James Cameron movie with, what's his name? Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. So the Titanic sank. 1,513 drowned, owing to an insufficient number of lifeboats. In 1985, the wreck was discovered in two pieces at a depth of 13,000 feet. Same year, 1912, the first successful parachute jump. Same year, 1912, we catch up to something I alluded to earlier, just when I gave the summary of Theodore Roosevelt, but this is where it fits in the chronology. The first attempt to harness the progressive movement into a national level political party occurred in the election year of 1912. The party platform had been restriction of child labor by laws. Passing laws. That's the progressive movement, where they want to use the government to fix everything. So pass laws to outlaw child labor, pass laws to permit women to vote, pass laws securing the rights of workers, pass laws mandating urban renewal, and pass laws that will enable the government to break up corporate monopolies. So the wounded vanity of Theodore Roosevelt required, he took over this, when he lost the nomination for the Republicans to run against Taft, his wounded vanity required a venue. So he took over the progressive movement and made it into a national level party, which he called the Bull Moose Party, because that was his ego, his self-understanding of himself. He's the aggressive, the Bull Moose. So he ran as a third-party candidate, which split the Republican Party and ensured the victory of the Democratic governor of the state of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson, to become the 28th president. He was sworn in on March 4th. That's when they were doing it then. Religiously, he was Presbyterian. Thomas, who's baptized Thomas Woodrow Wilson, was born on December 28, 1856, in Staunton, Virginia. His father was a Presbyterian minister. Wilson himself earned a doctorate in political science from Johns Hopkins in 1885, with a dissertation that was later published as a book titled Congressional Government. And it became a textbook for many years, even before he became president. He worked as a teacher himself, until he received appointment as president of Princeton University in 1902. Later, he decided to enter into politics at the state level. He was elected the 34th governor of New Jersey in 1910, representing the Democratic Party. From that position, he entered the presidential race in 1912 and won owing to the rift in the Republicans between Taft and Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson, a presidential fun fact, he was the first Southerner, born in the South, born in Virginia, the first Southerner to win election as president since 1848. Not just since the Civil War, but long before the Civil War. He was progressive in his governing philosophy, means pro-government, use bigger government to solve all problems. So he joined the neo-social gospel humanitarianism with the older Hamiltonian federalism ideology of using a strong central government to mandate and manage economic and social policy at a national level. The United States was officially neutral when the First World War began in 1914. Wilson won re-election in 1916 on the basis of a lie, of a peace platform. Nevertheless, 1 year later, he violated that and brought the United States into the First World War in response to German submarine attacks against merchant shipping that cost American lives. After the war, Wilson attempted to project American progressivism into an international political ideology, the idea of having a strong world government, or at least a world organization, to create and manage economic and social policy. So to this end, he promoted a new international construct, the League of Nations, in hopes that a permanent organization for international level dialogue would diffuse tension before future wars like the First World War could erupt. Republicans humiliated Wilson in the Senate. By refusing to ratify the treaty as punishment for Wilson's progressive policies, which they believed were un-American, anti-freedom, and harmful to the economy. Wilson suffered a series of strokes beginning in September of 1919 and never fully recovered. He died in 1924, 3 years after his second term ended. But before we get to the First World War, February 25th, 1913, the progressive axiom that the federal government was the best means of creating social improvement entailed a larger federal government, and that, in turn, necessitated generating the revenue to support it. The Constitution stipulated that the federal government be funded by excise taxes. So excise means a cut of. So customs, duties, and tariffs. So a cut of trade. And the founders did that intentionally because that's a very limited source of revenue. But they wanted a weak central government because they just fought a revolution against a strong monarchy. But obviously that revenue stream is not sufficient to support the open-ended expansion of government required to implement progressive plans of social and economic management. So another means of funding had to be invented. And their solution, the progressive solution, was to mandate that the entire population of the country be required to surrender ever larger amounts of their resources to the central government, which would expand its control of managing the same population. So in 1909, Congress passed the first tax on corporate profits and activated the legislative machinery to alter the Constitution in order to allow direct taxation on personal income. So this was unconstitutional. And the way that the founders wrote the Constitution, that is not permitted. Direct taxation was not permitted. So, like the federal government, the way the Constitution is written, the federal government could not tax state governments, because then the federal government could tax a state government into bankruptcy. So, in the same way, the Constitution did not permit the federal government to directly tax individuals, because then they could, an abuse of government like the monarchy, could impose punitive taxes in order to bankrupt individuals. So that means they had to change the Constitution in order to violate the Constitution. So the Constitution does have a provision to amend itself. So that's how they did it. That's how they got around it. So in the original Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 4, quote, "No capitation," so caput is head, so head tax, no taxing of individuals, "no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid, unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken." So this apportionment referred to Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3, which stipulated population among the states as the basis for their proportional representation in the House of Representatives. So in order to violate this, to circumvent it, the text of the amendment, which was the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, passed on February 25th, 1913, authorized a federal income tax with these words: "The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration." The enabling legislation. So whenever there's a constitutional amendment, it has to be written into the, fit into the to the existing legal framework. So the enabling legislation was the Underwood-Simmons Act of 1913, which implemented a 1% tax on incomes over $3,000 a year, and a graduated surtax on incomes over $20,000 a year. Only 3 years later, the Revenue Act of 1916 doubled that tax from 1% to 2% on incomes over $3,000, and the surtax of incomes, over between $3,000 and $20,000 was increased from 6% to 13%, and the Revenue Act of 1916 added a graduated estate tax. So when somebody dies, then their estate's tax, so the death tax. A graduated estate tax of 10% that the government just takes. Since then, the temptation to increase government spending without personal consequences to the members of the government has proved to be irresistible. And the imposition of a mandatory income tax fundamentally and permanently altered the relationship of the government to the governed, of the person to the government, into a posture of servitude. So now with this, instead of the government of the people, by the people, for the people, that's still theoretically the case, but this in reality inverted that, such that the government can do what the founders did not want. They can impose a tax on someone's income, and if that person refuses to pay it, then the government can take their freedom away, incarcerate them, and then take the money anyway from their estate. And that's life. You got to pay it. I'm not saying, but this is just historic. This is a change. This is a real change in the way things were done, and still are done. Okay. First World War. Let's see. Okay, we're done. So the First World War, 1914, 1918. So I've alluded to it several times, so here's where it fits in the chronology and the immediate trigger. In June of 1914, the Habsburg rulers of Austria wished to assert their domination over Serbia, which is part of the Balkans. So they planned to conduct military maneuvers in Bosnia, which, as we saw in a previous video, Austria invaded and stole in 1908, but which Serbia claimed to be part of Greater Serbia. Serbia claimed Bosnia to, be stolen from them. The heir apparent, their version of the Prince of Wales, the designated heir to the Austrian throne, had the rank of Archduke, and his name was Franz Ferdinand von Habsburg. He attended these maneuvers as a royal observer, and for reasons that can only be attributed to stupidity, he brought his wife with him, Sophie. Few acts were more insulting to Serbian national pride than a foreign power holding military maneuvers on territory they claimed. So in light of this provocation, a radical Serbian nationalist group, called itself the Black Hand, had sympathizers in the Serbian government. Those sympathizers were aware of the Archduke's itinerary, so they leaked that itinerary to the Black Hand, enabling the Black Hand to plan and carry out an ambush. And that ambush successfully executed, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo. There was a group involved, but the guy who actually did the deed was named Gavrilo Principi. And it occurred, the assassination occurred on June 28th, 1914. The Austrian emperor at the time was Franz Joseph von Habsburg. Now, his son was already dead. His son Rudolf had committed suicide years earlier. So Franz Ferdinand, the heir, was actually his nephew. And Franz Joseph hated his nephew. And Franz Joseph himself, his own wife had been assassinated by anarchists. His own brother, well, actually, I didn't mention his name, but it was his brother, Maximilian, who became Emperor of Mexico in the War of the Europeans against Juarez. And it was Maximilian was defeated and captured by Juarez and executed by Juarez. And that's the brother of the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph. This left Franz Joseph with his nephew Franz Ferdinand as heir. Franz Joseph steadfastly refused to abdicate despite his advancing age. He was born in 1830, but he was holding out because he did not trust his nephew. He thought his nephew was an idiot, thought he was too liberal, that he would make too many changes, and those changes would end the Habsburg monarchy. But regardless of the emperor's personal feeling, Austrian pride could not allow this crime to go unpunished. Fearing that Austria would use the assassination as a pretext to do to Serbia what they had already done to Bosnia, meaning invade and conquer, Serbia appealed to Russia for help. The guy running Russia was the Tsar Nicholas II, whom we introduced in an earlier video. In the supreme folly of a lifetime filled with daily acts of stupidity, this one outranks them all. The Tsar Nicholas II publicly declared that the Serbs were Slavic brothers of the Russians, and that Russia would not stand by and allow them to be crushed by Austria. Austria, remember, because of the alliances, was allied with Germany. Now, Germany didn't care who ruled Serbia, but Germany could not allow Austria to stand alone against Russia, because Austria was Germany's only remaining firm ally. I mean, the Ottoman Empire was also an ally, but they, it was approaching the failed state status. So Austria was really all Germany had. Plus, they shared a border. So the Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany, who's Wilhelm II, whom we already met, informed the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph that no matter what he decided to do, Germany would stand beside Austria. So this caused the overlapping of two previously separate constellations of problems, the diplomatic and the military. Diplomatically, the nations on both sides, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, were enmeshed within these alliance systems that required all members to go to war if any one of them were attacked. On the military side, the war plans, we covered the Schlieffen Plan, but all the nations had their own war plans. All the war plans were time sensitive, triggered the moment a potential antagonist mobilized. So once an enemy mobilized, a potential enemy mobilized, then you had to mobilize, even if you didn't want to fight. Because they were all afraid, well, if you let the enemy mobilize and get all their civilians in uniform, and remember, all their young men had been drafted and served in the military, so they all had done basic training already. So this is just, the mobilization is just getting them to their bases, getting them in uniform and armed and sent to whatever part of they were going to be sent to. So the practical consequence of this situation was that if any one of the great powers mobilized, no matter what the reason, Germany had no choice but to invade Belgium, to attack Belgium, to go through Belgium in order to attack France, even though neither France nor Belgium had any stake at all in this Balkan conflict between Austria and Serbia. So in the single decision that brought the civilization of European monarchies to an end as actual governing monarchies, Nicholas II mobilized Russia in defense of Serbia. And that was it. Instantly, Germany had to activate the Schlieffen Plan to commence, to mobilize, attack Belgium, to get through Belgium in order to invade France and force France to surrender so that they could move all their troops to the Eastern Front to face Russia. Appalled at this unbelievable act of stupidity, England was enmeshed. I mean, England was in the Triple Entente. So England, who really had no interest at all, Serbia's landlocked, and England was a naval power, so they certainly didn't care what happened to Serbia. But they were in the Triple Alliance. They were allied with France and Russia. So England could not afford to allow them to be defeated. So England had to declare war, at least believed it had to declare war in support of its allies. Supported in the eyes of public opinion, at least initially, because of Germany's criminal invasion of Belgium, which was neutral, and France, which was neither one were involved. So from the average, just the average Joe in England, well, what is this? Why is Germany invading? What did Belgium ever do to them? So it just came as a shock to everybody. I mean, ironically, we know more about all these war plans and alliances than the average person on the street knew at the time, even though they're the ones that ended up suffering for it. So with that, all of that took a month to develop, and so the First World War actually began in terms of everybody formally declaring 1 month, exactly 1 month to the day after the assassination. So the First World War began on July 28th, 1914. The Pope was still St. Pius X. He begged for calm, deliberation, peace, but the merging of the alliance systems with the war plans did not permit time for such activity. And of course, everybody thought the war would be over in the same year, just a couple of months. Nobody could dream, the bloodbath that was on the way. Pius X was ignored, and once again, the secular world jumped into the pits of hell by ignoring the Pope. And Pius himself died 1 month later, on August 20th, 1914, after a reign of 11 years and 16 days. His successor was, his actual name was baptized, Giacomo della Chiesa, Chiesa. He accepted election on September 3rd, 1914, as Pope 258. He did not keep his baptismal name, so as Pope he took the name Benedict, and he was the 15th to take that name. Benedict XV was a diplomat, more in the mold of Leo XIII, by way of contrast with Pius X. Pius X had regarded politics as a theater of deceit, that's his term, best avoided for the sake of spiritual health. Yet the war cast in opposition to each other nations with large Catholic populations, were on opposites on both sides. So France, on one side, was Catholic. Austria-Hungary, on the opposite side, was also Catholic. And in terms of the moral analysis, the context, was unclear, because not everybody knew all the background. The Habsburgs, looking on one side, the Habsburgs, their heir was murdered. So that and they did have a legitimate standing to want some kind of of justice for the assassination of the Archduke. Yet, waging a war, on the other side of the analysis, waging a war of nation against nation violated proportionality. So one guy whom the Austrians regarded as innocent was murdered, and that was unjust. So, the other side was, okay, but going to war to avenge that means you're going to kill thousands upon thousands of other innocent people who had nothing to do with this. Slaughtering thousands cannot be a justifiable punishment for the killing of one. Yet, another perspective, the war plans. Now, this is one that everybody didn't know. I mean, obviously the war plans were secret, so the general public didn't know the time pressure. I mean, they might have intuited, it's best to, if you're going to do something, do it first. But they didn't know all the precise details. So the war plans involved invasion of nations. Invasion of nations not at all involved in the conflict. And that's something the average person didn't know. And also the time pressure, which we've already covered, that the German war plan required a swift defeat of France. And I already went through the Schlieffen plan, so I won't go through that. So this left both sides bereft of any coherent moral architecture beyond fighting to win. And the appalling casualties inflicted by modern weaponry, which nobody expected when this began, left the leaders on both sides, the more and more people died, it left the leaders on all sides with no viable option other than the total destruction of the opponent to justify, the many sacrifices they demanded from their own people. Desperation pushed Germany to avail itself of another contrivance of modern industry, the submarine. Tactically employed against enemy warships, the Germans eventually concluded that the merchant ships of the world were legitimate targets, since some of them, inevitably, were going to be carrying materials to feed the war industry of the enemy. But merchant ships are officially civilian. The sinking of officially civilian ships is what provoked the United States to enter the First World War on the side of England and France. Now, in terms of the American church, the American Catholic hierarchy provided material cooperation to the war effort by promoting the sale of what was called Liberty bonds then. It's government bonds, but specifically to fund the war effort, just as they had in the 19th century in the Spanish-American War, even though Spain's a Catholic country. And in the First World War, money contributed to the war effort would be used against the Catholic nation of Austria-Hungary. Okay. All right, I'll pause here. So we have the background of the war. Before we go into the details, I'll pause here because then the video will end up being too long if I don't. So we'll pick up with that, with the chronology of the First World War in the next video. Thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.